So when we left things last time, guns had a bewildering variety of names and just as bewildering a variety of functions. Not only that, but they could be made of bronze or iron, they could be made to shoot iron or stone, and when it came to deciding whether you wanted bronze or iron guns, well, you didn't have to worry about any particular role because there were direct equivalents in both metals. However, as the 17th century drew on and naval tactics began to evolve more towards the line of battle, which required an incredibly large number of broadside guns as opposed to the slightly smaller number of guns that earlier ships had, both due to the ships being smaller and also due to the demand for having guns facing in all directions, which made it somewhat less important to have a massed battery in any one facing, there was now a demand for many and heavier guns. Accuracy was also becoming something of an issue, as whilst naval tactics still did centre around the boarding action as a final decisive factor in whether or not an enemy ship surrendered, it was also becoming more common to simply batter a ship into surrender, or in some rare cases sinking, simply with gunfire. And if you were going to do that, ideally speaking, you wanted to shoot at your enemy from as far away as possible. There were, of course, limitations on what a human eye could calculate in terms of range and deflection, but there was a difference between that and the point-blank range that most gunfights generally occurred at in the earlier periods. A point-blank range gunfight with boarding action was, of course, still something that could occur, and in actions between single ships of approximately the same weight class, this was actually quite common. However, when ships were significantly outclassed by their opponent, having more accurate guns would give them an opportunity to pick away at the enemy ship's crew and sails, whilst giving an opportunity to escape, and in a battle line, well, a line of capital ships was a relatively unwieldy thing, and so getting in close with a full line of battle was a relatively rare event that usually only occurred right towards the end, and so again, for capital ship firepower, accuracy was becoming more and more important. With ships having a finer length to beam ratio, they were also becoming slightly faster, and if they were faster and they were trying to run away, then you'd want to try and slow them down if you were the pursuer. And so once again, accuracy was in high demand, as if you had relatively few chase guns in your, relatively speaking, narrow bow, you wanted to be able to use those to maximum effect to try and dismast your opponent so that you could overhaul them. And on the flip side, if you were the one being chased and you only had a few stern guns, then equally you'd want to slow down your pursuer. And with older guns that could shoot somewhere in that general vicinity, but aiming at something like an individual person or a mast at several hundred yards range was more based on luck than judgment, this was not really a possibility. And so whilst you might think that in the middle of the 17th century, ships were firing solid shot from various naval guns, and by the early 19th century, ships were still firing solid shot from various naval guns, and whilst they might look vaguely similar, there had in fact been a massive amount of technological change. So let's have a look at that. We're going to look at materials, we're going to look at accuracy, we're going to look at types of shot, and we're going to look at types of gun. What we might think of as the traditional naval cannon, but also two important innovations that were taken to sea in this period, the mortar and the carronade. So materials first. Bronze guns were still around in relatively large numbers. However, during what in the UK would be called the Tudor period, which would be the late 15th and going into the 16th centuries, the start had been made on mass-producing cast iron cannon. Now, this had varied results. They were, of course, cheaper, as we covered in the previous video, but they did have a slightly more distressing tendency to explode as compared to the more refined bronze variants. There was also some issue with what was called windage, because at the time, at least in the early to mid-1600s, it was very difficult to drill or bore out cast iron. Bronze, being a softer metal, could be turned on a lathe much like a giant piece of wood. This meant that iron guns had to be cast in a mould that included a spindle for the bore, and in turn this meant that the casting was always going to be slightly rough, which meant you had to allow for a little bit more windage. That is the gap between the cannonball and the gun barrel itself. And this in turn reduced accuracy and power, because expanding gas could come around the ball as much as it was propelling it. And it also meant that the gun would wear out faster, because the ball to a certain extent would rattle its way down the barrel rather than proceeding in a nice, neat, orderly straight line. There was also the issue that whilst iron guns didn't explode quite as often as they used to, as quality control experience and expertise had improved over time, thus making the final product a lot more reliable, one of the ways that this reliability had been achieved was by casting the guns a lot thicker. This in turn meant that they weighed more, which was something of a concern when you were on board a ship. If you were in a fort or some other land-based garrison, then an additional 20 or 30% weight on your guns didn't actually make too much odds. But if you were on a ship, that could mean that you could only carry 3 guns instead of 4. If you could have a lighter weapon, and the lighter weapons did exist, because although bronze is actually denser than iron, and therefore for a given thickness a bronze gun would be heavier, due to its greater reliability and slightly lower potential to explode, bronze guns could be cast a lot thinner and therefore a lot lighter than the average iron gun. And of course, when you were at sea, you were in a saltwater environment, and a bronze gun wasn't at anything like the same risk of oxidation as an iron gun was. All of these factors meant that whilst iron guns were available in ever-increasing numbers, bronze guns remained favoured in navies, especially for larger weapons. Although as the price of iron guns decreased through mass manufacture and refinements in technique, and bronze became more scarce and expensive due to demands for bronze outside of gun casting, it meant that with the best intentions, even a very rich and powerful navy could not afford bronze guns for all of its vessels, and thus bronze cannon became more and more restricted, eventually only showing up in the largest and most prestigious vessels. For example, in the early 1700s, HMS Victory, a first rate that was the immediate predecessor to Nelson's HMS Victory, was one of the very last Royal Navy ships to have a bronze gun armament. The loss of all those bronze guns was one of the major cost items involved in the loss of the ship. And it wasn't just the monetary value alone, it was also the strategic value, because once an iron gun wore out, and to be fair, they did wear out relatively quickly compared to bronze weapons, you could just replace it with another one, as an iron gun cost just under half of what its equivalent in bronze would cost. But iron was plentiful, whereas bronze could be recast, but was also incredibly expensive, so you wouldn't want to be bringing in new bronze every time a bronze gun wore out. You'd simply take the old cannon and melt it down and cast a new one. So with 100 guns going down on the old HMS Victory, that was not just 100 guns lost, which in an iron gun's case could simply be replaced from a stockpile, it was probably 1,000 guns worth of recasting that had gone down with the vessel. The weight issue would be another major driving factor behind technological innovation in the manufacture of ships' guns, because, as we said, if the ship's gun is lighter, you can fit more of them on a ship that can support a given weight. So there were a number of other weight savings that could be made. In the late 1600s and even into the early 1700s, guns were still very ornate objects, much as they had been in the Tudor period. Plenty of decoration, moulding and relief work would take place, but all of this used up material, and that material weighed a certain amount. If you took all of that off, you ended up with a much plainer and more boring looking weapon, but that weapon might weigh several dozen pounds less than the more decorated item. Now, you could use that in a number of ways. You could increase the amount of ammunition that you were carrying, or if you factor that small reduction in weight across several dozen guns, you might be able to fit 2, 3 or 4 more guns in, again for the same weight. This change was gradual, but by about 1750, guns were, generally speaking, a lot plainer and a lot simpler. they were the kind of weapon that you might recognise on the deck of Nelson's Victory and would be seen throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Also around this time, the old hollow casting method with the spindle was abandoned in favour of the newly developed gun barrel boring technology that had been refined by the Swiss of all people, which allowed English guns, for example, to reduce their windage by about 20%. This tightening of the gap between barrel and cannonball meant that a given powder charge could propel the ball a lot further because less of its energy would be lost going around the side or rattling the ball down the barrel, and thus you could afford to make the gun shorter for the same amount of power. And of course, a shorter gun weighs less, which means you can carry even more guns. And this wasn't a small change in weight either, like you might have by simply taking the decorations off the guns. For a 24-pounder or 32-pounder gun, which would be the kind that you'd find on a large ship of the line, the reduction could be as much as 2 feet of gun barrel length to give the same power when you compare the older, less precisely manufactured weapons to the newer, more precisely manufactured iron guns. This also served to make gunnery easier, as it meant that with the same amount of rope and pulley, a shorter gun would run further inside a ship, thus giving the crew more access to it, or alternatively, you could tighten up on the amount of rope and pulley work that you had if you were happy to reload the gun at roughly the same kind of muzzle run-in as previously, and this would serve to give slightly more space in the middle of the ship, which allowed for the easier transport of ammunition, powder, and wounded men. Another simple but important advance was the relocation of the gun's trunnions to the centre of the barrel. The trunnions are the 2 stubby metal cylinders that protrude from the side of the gun and which are used to mount it on its carriage. Under the old practice, the trunnions had been mounted relatively low on the gun, so that the gun sat quite high above the carriage. This exerted quite a bit of strain on the gun carriage, as whenever you fired the gun, the force of the blast would try and effectively push the gun up and over. By mounting the trunnions more along the centre line of the gun, it meant that the force was directed straight backwards, which was a much easier thing to compensate for, and provided a lot less strain on the upper works of gun carriages, which made guns flying off their carriages and flying around the ship something of a less common occurrence than it had been previously. There was also the matter of banding. Back when guns had been built up like barrels, you very definitely did need reinforcement bands in order to ensure that the gun didn't split, or at least reduce the chances of it splitting. Now that guns were single cast pieces and were somewhat more reliable than the early versions, these reinforcements were not so much needed, although it still did help to have them moulded at various points, which gave the appearance of a barrel-like gun. But these additional points of mass provided a certain amount of strengthening at critical points along the gun barrel. In particular, at the mouth of the gun, the extra thickness served as something of a heat sink and also delayed or prevented the propagation of cracks. Further reducing the size of the gun needed in terms of barrel length was a slight reduction in the amount of powder used. This was as a result of experiments, again in the 1700s, which demonstrated that at full charge, the cannon that were being used at the time could actually shoot a lot further than anyone could reasonably expect them to hit when they were at sea, when the target was moving and when the ship that they were mounted on was also moving. And so by slightly reducing the charge, the gun's effectiveness at any kind of practical range remained pretty much the same, but since the gun itself was not being fired with anywhere near as much force, you could further reduce the overall weight of the gun, either by shortening the barrel length still further, or by slightly narrowing the casting. All of these elements combined to a point where accuracy with a cannon, much as that would have been the subject of much hilarity and derision in the 1500s and early 1600s, was now, by the mid-1700s and early 1800s, a very real thing, dependent largely on the skill of the gun crew, to a certain extent the quality of the powder, and a little bit to do with the quality of the shot itself. Again in the mid-1700s, which was something of a watermark period for naval gun development, the Royal Navy began adopting flintlock firing mechanisms for its guns, although they're more accurately called gun locks when installed aboard a cannon as opposed to a pistol. These allowed for the gun to be fired much more precisely in time with the given orders, as opposed to the old use of a slow match with a priming hole, or even in some cases a short fuse. This meant that a well-trained gunner who knew his gun very well could, at least over a range of several hundred yards, pretty much guarantee to within a yard or so where his shot was going to go. Now, a sniper rifle it wasn't, but for naval combat it pretty much had the same effect, because this meant that accuracy with these particular guns, especially if simple iron sights were installed on them, as was done in some navies and on some particular ships, was precise enough that instead of hoping to maybe hit a ship with a portion of the guns that you had on your broadside, this individual weapon could track in on specific parts of a ship, and whilst the first shot might not hit, the second or third almost certainly would. And so, especially when it came to chase guns, but sometimes also with quarterdeck guns, which would be of somewhat more use in a broadside action, certain gunners who were particularly skilled could start to pick off things like the helmsman, the ship's wheel, or take repeated shots into a ship's mast. Needless to say, in the blaze and din of battle, you probably would attribute the ship's wheel or a mast or an officer being hit by a cannonball to sheer happenstance and blind luck. After all, the enemy might be firing anything from 1 to 2 dozen and anything up to 3 or 4 dozen guns at you, and so one of those cannonballs hitting something particularly vital might just be written off, but these precision gunners would be able to hit those kinds of targets repeatedly. Indeed, in one of the combats towards the later end of this period, the battle between HMS Shannon and USS Chesapeake, one such gunner aboard the Shannon not only shot away Chesapeake's wheel, but repeatedly blew away a succession of helmsmen who tried to get the ship back under control. So with the guns themselves now mostly made of iron and standardized quite significantly in terms of appearance and reliability as compared to their earlier iterations, what about the size of the weapons and their shot? Well, these two things were intertwined, as most guns were rated by the weight of shot that they fired rather than any particular caliber, since the caliber was simply held to be however wide a round shot is when it weighs a certain amount. This, of course, meant that gun calibers were a little bit weird when you look at them in pure measurement amounts. For example, a 9-pounder gun in an English ship would usually have approximately 4.2 inches of bore, whilst a French 9-pounder gun would have 4.34 inches of bore. And you might think, well, why is that? Because surely they're both 9-pounder guns. Well, yes, but tolerances accepted on the windage in British and French guns were slightly different, but also the systems of weights and measures were slightly different in each nation. And thus, whilst everyone might use something that could be loosely translated to a pound measure, a French pound would weigh slightly different to an English pound, which would weigh slightly different to a Spanish pound, etc., etc. And as we said, they may have slightly different names for this particular unit of weight. But what that meant was that the so-called, say, 9-pounder shot would actually weigh something slightly different in absolute terms on different nations' ships. Now, if you were, say, on an English ship or a British ship, depending on which side of the Act of Union you were on in this era, and your pound weight was slightly less than a French pound weight, then you're actually in good fortune, because with a little bit of extra wadding, you could use your 9-pounder cannonballs in a French gun. However, if the reverse was applied, you were a little bit more out of luck, since if you were a French vessel, if you were to capture a Royal Navy warship, you would find that whilst you could use their ammunition, you couldn't use their guns, because your ammunition wouldn't quite fit. The system of weights for guns had actually been inherited from Elizabethan times, that would be the late 15 and early 1600s. And generally, aboard a Royal Navy warship at least, you could find a mixture, depending on the size of the vessel, of 6, 9, 12, 18, 24, 32 or 42-pounder guns. The 32-pounder and 42-pounder weapons were generally found only on the largest ships of the line, and to be honest, the 24-pounder wasn't exactly that common outside of ships of the line generally, although they would feature in smaller ships of the line as the main battery, such as on a 4th rate 64-gunner. Most frigates would carry a primary battery of 18-pounder or 12-pounder guns, depending on their size, with the 6 and 9-pounders being used either on unrated vessels as a main battery, as a secondary battery, maybe on the quarterdeck or similar for frigates, or very high up on the ship as specific sniping weapons, chase guns, signalling guns, and supplementary upper deck weapons on a ship of the line. In other nations, there were similar systems of rating called establishments of guns, the French, for example, setting an early one in the late 17th century using 4, 8, 12, 16, 24, 32 and 48-pounder guns, although they would also later go on to adopt a 36-pounder weapon. Of these, the 40-plus pounder weapons fell out of use by about the mid-1750s. The guns were incredibly heavy, and to be perfectly honest, a 42-pounder or 48-pounder ball was incredibly difficult for 1 or 2 men to manhandle in a pitching and rolling ship. To be honest, they weren't the easiest things to handle on land either, and so the rate of fire and the casualties amongst the gun crew from simply trying to work the guns were very low and very high, respectively, and so these began to fall out of use, with the Royal Navy standardising on the 32-pounder as its heaviest main ship's gun, and the French on the 36-pounder. Generally speaking, for the so-called classic age of sail, which ranges, depending on who you ask, but from roughly the mid-1700s to the early 1800s at its core, and extending slightly further beyond it and significantly further back by various metrics, the typical armament of a Royal Navy warship that had 3 decks, i.e. a first or second rate, would be a lower deck battery of 32-pounder guns, then a middle deck battery of either 24-pounder or 18-pounder guns, and then an upper deck battery, usually of 12-pounder guns, with various other weapons scattered throughout the vessel. As we mentioned before, smaller, lighter guns in various higher locations. On a third-rate ship of the line, one with 2 main gun decks, you would either have a primary gun deck of 32 or 24-pounder guns, it varied depending on the exact size and who had built the ship in question, with an upper deck battery of either 18 or 12-pounder weapons. Occasionally some weaker third rates would have an upper deck battery of 9-pounders, but this was very rare. A fourth rate, typically a 64-gunner, would carry a main battery of 24-pounders, with an upper deck battery of 9 or 12-pounders, although again, smaller, weaker vessels might carry an 18-pounder lower deck battery, but this was exceptionally rare, and generally speaking, if you were in a 64-gunner that needed a 18-pounder main gun battery, it was probably rotted out and desperately trying to get home anyway. In the earlier part of this period, there were also 50-gunners, which carried 24-pounder main deck armaments and upper deck armaments of 12-pounder guns, but these were derated in the mid-1750s as being no longer fit to stand in the line of battle, and since they were somewhat more bulky and more heavily built than frigates, they were broken up in relatively short order. Although a few would continue to be built for various specific purposes, usually overseas stations. You would then have your 5th-rate frigates. These would typically carry an 18-pounder single deck of guns, with various lighter weapons, usually 9-pounders and the odd 6-pounder scattered higher in the ship. A 6th rate would typically be found with a 12-pounder main armament, although 6th rates with 9-pounder main armaments were not necessarily unknown. This then helps put into context the oddballs like the American 6 frigates, which carried a main armament of 24-pounder guns, where typically you would expect to find 18-pounders. And of course it also covers the Rasé frigates, which were developed from cut-down ships of the line, usually taking a third rate and removing a single upper deck level, and these would retain their lower gun decks from their previous incarnation, and thus you could have Razé frigates which would be running around with 24-pounder main deck batteries, and then upper decks that might be carrying a slightly heavier than average secondary gun battery. Or you might end up with some of the really heavy ones that might even retain a 32-pounder gun deck battery, which would be quite the punch for a frigate-sized vessel to be seen with, and also would then typically carry a slightly heavier upper deck battery as well. So into all of this, we have to mention two other types of gun, because whilst they're all called guns at this point, and we might as well call them cannon because colloquially that's what we all know them as now, there were two other primary forms of ship-borne ordnance: the mortar, which was very specialist, and the carronade, which was slightly less specialist. The mortar was a very short-barreled, massive weapon which was designed to lob various projectiles in high arcs. A counterpart on land might be the howitzer, although mortars were also used on land, the main distinction being that mortars tended to just come on a bed, which was not particularly mobile, whilst howitzers tended to come on carriages. Now, these weapons were not generally used on the average warship because of their high angle of fire. This had two major problems, one of which was that, well, if you're firing at a high angle, that means you have to mount the thing on the deck, and they were very heavy, as I said, which had stability issues, but also, well, guns of that time and guns going forward do tend to have something of a muzzle flash, and what's above the deck of a sailing warship? Oh yeah, sails and rope, which are all very flammable. You don't really want to be putting long flares of burning gunpowder up in that particular direction, but also they were not the world's most accurate weapons without a lot of dialing in, and ships tended to move quite quickly for a mortar like this, and so the chances of actually hitting a moving target like a ship with a mortar were pretty slim if you were on another ship. The other factor, of course, was that because these guns were firing very much higher and they were sitting on a bed, the force of their recoil would be sent straight down into the deck, and a lot of ships' decks were simply not set up for the kind of stress that would be involved with both putting a mortar on top of them in the first place and then having that mortar fire and the force go into the deck. So mortars tended to be found on specialist vessels, usually called bomb vessels, which tended to be a lot smaller, and the mortar would be their primary armament. They'd have a few small guns for seeing off boats and maybe the odd small unrated warship, but generally these were siege vessels. They would be used to bombard forts, cities, and anything else on land that needed a good seeing to. You could aim these either by varying the powder charge, which you would sometimes have to do on the so-called fixed mortars, which could not be changed in their elevation, or you could change the elevation of the mortar, which obviously needed a set of trunnions, but this was perhaps a slightly quicker way of dialing the mortar into its target, even if its target was something as basic as a gigantic fort, as compared to trying to vary the exact amount of gunpowder that you would use to propel your ball, given that obviously every time you fired, the gun or mortar would get hotter, and the longer you left it, it would get cooler, so you would never have quite the right idea as to exactly how much gunpowder you were using. One of the reasons they were built so massively and weighed so much was because they had next to no recoil space, and so they also had to be very strong to withstand the blast and force of their own charge. They also fired two types of ammunition which would not be seen in the more conventional horizontal firing ship's armament. These were shells and so-called carcass shot. And yes, that is an explosive shell. No, we won't be dealing with the more direct fire shell guns until the next episode, but these shells were fairly primitive weapons. If you've ever seen a Wile E. Coyote cartoon or other similar cartoon of that era, and you've seen the big metal sphere with the fuse coming out the top, you're not too far off the shells of this time. They were quite literally big cast iron spheres, although there were some that were also stone, banded together to make sure they didn't fall apart, and full of explosive. You would put in a fuse, you would light the fuse, you would then drop the now live shell into the mortar and fire the mortar. The shell would go sailing off, and after a certain amount of time the fuse would burn out and the shell would explode. Whether this was in midair, just on target, or whether it would come crashing down and then explode and do a lot of damage, or whether it would come crashing down, split apart, and just sort of fizzle and burn a little bit, was all a little bit unpredictable. And so this was another reason why mortars tended to be used as general area bombardment weapons for fairly substantial targets like forts and cities, rather than in any kind of precision strike role. The other type of unique ammunition they used was the so-called carcass. The carcass shot was an early form of incendiary ammunition. Like the shell, it was a hollow iron sphere, but instead of being filled with simple explosive, it would be filled with all sorts of interesting burnables, tar and pitch being particular favourites. After having been set on fire, the carcass shot would again be loaded into a mortar and fired happily into the sky. It would burn for between 5 and 10 minutes with quite an intense flame, and so when it came crashing down in the middle of your target, which usually had a lot of burnables in it, even if it was on land, it would present something of a major fire hazard. Carcass shot was found in more conventional horizontal firing guns occasionally, but it was relatively rare. One, because it took a lot longer to prepare and load, and obviously loading a burning piece of ammunition into your gun when your gun has a powder charge waiting inside of it is a little bit more risky, but also because these were spheres and wooden ships, whilst made of wood, were still built fairly substantially, firing a carcass shot at another ship was generally less likely to be a fire hazard and more likely just a way of splattering the side of the ship with a bunch of low-order burning and metal fragments, which was not really that much of a threat as opposed to, say, a 32-pounder cannonball punching through the side and demolishing everything in its path. So with mortars out of the way, let's talk for a bit about the carronade. Now, the carronade was an invention of this period, developed in the 1760s by the appropriately named Carron Company, which was a gun foundry in Scotland, and from which the term carronade takes its name. Initially, these were actually developed and marketed for use aboard merchant ships. Because the Carron Company manufactured both the weapon and the shot, it meant that they could be built to much tighter tolerances than a generally manufactured cannon could be, which might have to accept shot from all over the place with slightly different ideas of exactly what constituted bore size. The carronade was also a lot more lightly built than the cannon because it only used half the powder charge, and it was a lot shorter than the cannon, which meant that the projectile wouldn't fly anywhere near as far nor anywhere near as fast as a cannon of the same bore diameter. But for merchant ships, this was not so much of a problem, since their main hazard was fighting off pirates. No merchant ship was ever going to fight off a significant-sized warship, but pirates with light cannon were something of a problem. However, obviously a merchant ship's value is in its cargo, and to get at the cargo you had to board the ship, and that meant that pirates would tend to approach to very close range to first try and batter the ship into submission, and then of course to try and board. So if they were going to come nice and close to you, the short range of the carronade didn't make too many odds. Additionally, as a merchant weapon, it would only ever be loaded with a single round at a time, whereas long guns, as cannons were sometimes called, had to be rated against being double-shotted. This was the practice of, as the term might suggest, loading 2 shots instead of 1 for that extra bit of close-range punch, but something we'll come and talk about in a minute. Thus, as a relatively small, lightweight weapon that didn't take up too much space, didn't need too much gunpowder stored aboard, and could be operated by a relatively small crew, they were relatively popular amongst British merchantmen, who of course they were marketed to. However, over time, the military, well, obviously the Royal Navy in particular, came to see the carronade as a useful adjutant weapon. That is, it wouldn't replace the main battery of a ship, but where a ship might carry a 6, 9, or maybe even if they were really lucky, a 12-pounder on the bow or on the quarterdeck for general purpose use. In close quarters, a carronade actually had a number of advantages. Specifically, the reason those guns mounted high up on a warship were so light was for stability reasons. Now, with a carronade, for the same weight, you could have a weapon that had a much larger bore. And there was another advantage. Because a cannon had to fire at a, relatively speaking, long range, at very short ranges, in the kind of melee swirl of a frigate action or the final pell-mell action of a Nelsonian-style fleet engagement, or just a simple boarding action, a cannonball was relatively likely to just punch a hole clean through the enemy ship. Now, this was bad news for anything that happened to be directly in the way, but it produced relatively little in the form of splinters, which were one of the primary casualty-causing aspects of gunfire at the time. And so the overall effect was relatively small, unless you switch to some other kind of shot, which again we'll discuss in a minute. With the carronade, however, you could fit a much larger bore weapon high up in the ship, and this, because of its lower muzzle velocity, would not only send a very heavy and larger projectile through the side of an enemy ship, but with its lower velocity it would have more of a smashing than a punching effect and create a lot more splinters. Thus, without affecting the overall fighting power of a warship at long range with its main battery of long guns, a small battery of carronades high up in the ship could offer substantially more close-range firepower than could a handful of small, lightweight long guns. A few ships were fitted experimentally with all carronade armaments, as this would theoretically allow even something as small as a fourth rate to carry a greater weight of broadside than a first rate with a more conventional armament. But whilst this was very successful at close range, the fact that warship battles could and did take place at long range as well meant that this was generally not held to be particularly advantageous, as an enemy vessel would notice that it was firing at long range and not really receiving any reply, come to the fairly obvious conclusion that the enemy ship must either be incredibly stupid or else armed entirely with carronades, and in either case you wanted to stay as far away as possible. In the first case, because you didn't want the stupidity to stick to you in case it was contagious, and in the latter case because, well, broadside from 24 and heavy carronades at close range would probably be the end of you. One famous example of both the advantages and disadvantages of this particular type of armament would be the USS Essex of the American Navy in the War of 1812. Whilst its replacement of 12-pounder long guns with 32-pounder carronades certainly gave it an absolutely vicious bite for a small frigate at short range, it would eventually come a cropper when two small Royal Navy frigates armed with more conventional long-barreled guns simply shot it to pieces outside of the range at which it could effectively reply. Of course, once adopted for military use, carronades became significantly larger, with 32-pounder carronades, as with the Essex, becoming relatively common weapons, giving, at least at short range, very small ships the ability to punch with a few weapons that had the same kind of firepower as a first-rate ship of the line's main guns. Seeing as they were so light, they were also highly favoured for simply supplementing the ship's battery instead of replacing existing guns, and so in the latter part of the 1700s and early 1800s you would find quite a number of ships that would be armed with significantly more guns than their official rating said, and these would be largely made up of these lightweight carronades. One particularly nasty example of the employment of these military-grade carronades was HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, where in addition to its just over 100 standard long guns, some clever person had installed a pair of massive 68-pounder carronades on the bow. And some bright spark, most accounts say a Royal Marine, decided that firing a 68-pounder cannonball at point-blank range into the stern of the French flagship Bucentaure was nasty, but not nasty enough for his taste, and so grabbed a keg of 500 musket balls, shoved that in on top, impromptu creating the world's largest and most lethal shotgun, and probably blasted several hundred of the French crew into oblivion. It took other navies a good while to catch on to this particular tactic, and so for a good part of the various wars with France that characterised the late 1700s and as they trended into the Napoleonic Wars, British warships tended to find themselves with a little bit of an unexpected punch in their batteries, which helped greatly when fighting enemy vessels, especially those that were ostensibly more heavily armed. The French did experiment with a version of the small, lightweight, low-velocity weapon that tried to fire explosive shells similar to those found in mortars, but it proved to be a little bit too difficult to operate and fairly dangerous, and was phased out fairly quickly. Of course, carronades were used to great effect by other American frigates during the War of 1812, as their fairly substantial size meant that not only could they carry an unusually heavy 24-pounder main battery, but they could also carry some fairly heavy carronade batteries as well, with 32-pounder carronades not being an uncommon sight on ships such as USS Constitution. And so, heading back to the ship's main battery of long guns, we come to the final part of the discussion for this era, which is the ammunition. Now, the ammunition that was used was obviously most commonly the simple round shot, which, as the name suggests, is just a big iron ball. This is multi-purpose. I mean, an iron ball of any particular size travelling at high speed will kill anything that gets in its way. Also useful at punching holes in the side of enemy ships, dismounting guns, badly weakening masts, and if you're really lucky, severing the odd bit of rigging. About the only thing they're not particularly brilliant at is getting rid of an enemy's ability to move by punching holes in the sails, because, well, although punching a hole in the sail does reduce its utility somewhat, a single small hole in a bit of canvas the size of a tennis court or larger is probably not going to impair the ship all that much. There were a few other types, though. Some types of ammunition found in cannon were just used on land, and so we'll focus mainly on those used aboard ships. If you were jealous of the carronade gunners and you too wanted to own a gigantic shotgun, you had two options. There was canister shot and grape shot. Canister shot was very much like a smaller version of that ingenious gunner aboard HMS Victory, in that, well, as the name suggests, it was a can that was filled with a bunch of musket balls. Obviously not quite 500, but you take what you can get. And unsurprisingly, this also made the cannon into a giant shotgun. The one problem with this is that, with the best will in the world, a musket ball, even if you fire it from a cannon, is not going to penetrate the side of an Age of Sail warship, even at point-blank range. It might stick in the sides, but you'd really be wanting to use canister to clear the decks on the upper decks, and that's probably about it. Grape shot, on the other hand, probably still not going to get through the side of a first rate, but certainly could get through the lighter parts of smaller vessels and would be a lot more effective against the kind of light to medium cover that you'd get on the deck of a wooden warship, as, like canister shot, it was a collection of smaller shots all held together. But grape shot would use significantly larger projectiles. As the name would suggest, they could be about the size of a grape, they could be up to the size of a golf ball or a large marble. And yeah, that'd hurt a bit. There was, as already mentioned, the opportunity to fire double shot, which was normally two round shot, one on top of the other, but you could add an additional form of ammunition on top of a single round shot, such as canister or grape or some of the others we're going to discuss in a minute. These double-shotted guns would be used at close range because, of course, you've roughly doubled the mass that you're firing, but you've not increased your powder charge, so they're not going to fly as fast and they're not going to fly as far, which is similar to how a carronade works, but for the reasons we discussed with the carronade, this actually makes them more effective at close range. And, well, since you're firing two lots of ammunition, you're going to hit hopefully twice as much stuff. There was also Langridge, which was basically the desperate or poor man's version of grape or canister shot, and this was a lot less sort of regulated and contained. This was basically anything hard that might hurt somebody, just stuff it all into a small sack or straight down the barrel and fire that and see what happens. There was usually a few bits and pieces of debris lying around a ship after any kind of significant battle had gone on for any significant length of time, but it was unpredictable and markedly less effective than the more regulation canister and grape. There was also heated shot. This was pretty dangerous to use aboard a ship. It was most commonly used by forts, but you would occasionally find heated shot being used on a ship as well. And again, the name is fairly self-explanatory. You would heat a shot, usually a round shot, up to a very high temperature. You'd have to use either clay or dampened wadding to ensure that putting it down the barrel didn't immediately set off the charge and leave you with short one rammer and possibly one arm. And then you would fire this at your target. The idea of this being that when the shot arrives and hopefully sticks in the hull or runs around inside the hull of the ship, it obviously being very, 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 very hot, would set off fires aboard the enemy vessel and also could be fairly uncomfortable to try and pick up. Fire, of course, being the big enemy of wooden warships, not something you wanted to mess with, but the thing is, in order to get it up to such temperature, you needed a fairly intense fire aboard your own ship, and the ship's cook would usually put the galley stove out already, so if you were willing to intentionally risk having a very hot fire aboard your ship whilst enemy shot is running through your ship, well, you might gain some advantage out of it. You might also set fire to yourself. It's a common occupational hazard in a lot of places. An older form of projectile that was pretty much being phased out by the start of this period, but was still around in a few places, was the fire arrow, although this should be more called the fire spear, because that was really the size of it, which was basically a spear-sized dart with usually with some fins on it, wrapped up with some incendiaries around the shaft, and then this whole collection would be blasted at the enemy like a giant arrow, and then would stick into something, hopefully, and then the incendiaries would do their work. It was very complicated, not particularly reliable, and as gun barrel lengths were cut down for weight-saving purposes, as we mentioned earlier, it became less and less accurate, and quite frankly, it needed a lot of space to store. That and the fact that, well, again, it's an incendiary weapon, and thus you have to store incendiaries aboard your own ship, which puts you at quite a lot of risk. The last kind of ammunition was anti-sail ammunition. This would be a type of shot that you would fire to try and bring down enemy sails by ripping them to pieces, as well as cutting up rigging and such like. This took two broad forms, bar shot and chain shot. Bar shot generally consisted of two half spheres or discs, which were joined by a solid metal bar. In some advanced versions, this bar could also telescope somewhat. And chain shot was pretty much the same idea, although it usually used full round shot at either end, linked, as will come as a little surprise to you again by the name, by chains. Lots of things in this period were fairly easily named. And the idea of these was that when you fired them, because the masses were never quite entirely right, and let's face it, one had come out slightly before the other, they would start to spin like a pair of demented high-speed lethal bowlers. And, well, you can imagine the effect if one of these things, especially a long chain shot, say, wrapped around a mast, spinning round, cutting through it to a certain degree, and then the two shots slamming into it, or whirling through the air, wrapping around rigging and tearing it apart, possibly going through sails, putting huge rips through them, etc., etc. It was a very good way to immobilize your enemy pretty quickly. The one disadvantage, of course, being that the individual aspects of bar and chain shot were somewhat lighter and a little bit less aerodynamic than the average round shot, and so they would do less damage to the hull of a vessel. Although, to be perfectly frank, if you fired a raking blast of chain shot from some of your higher guns down the main deck of an enemy warship, that's not going to do good things to the crew on any day of the week. Towards the end of the period we're looking at, as the 18th turned into the 19th century, there were a few final advances with guns for this period. Gun metallurgy improved to the point that the banding on guns was no longer necessary even as a moulded item, and so cannon began to take on a very elongated and smooth appearance. But broadly speaking, a cannon in 1820 would be just as recognisable to a sailor from 1650 as the reverse. It would be slightly shorter, a lot less ornate, but the functioning mechanisms, with perhaps the exception of the flintlock firing device, were pretty much the same. Internally, however, the cannon had become a lot more accurate, it had become a lot easier to manufacture and a lot more reliable. It used less powder to get a better effect. It could be used in certain circumstances as a kind of gigantic sniper, just as much as it could be used in other circumstances as a kind of gigantic shotgun. They really were the Swiss Army gun of the seas. But generally speaking, in open ocean combat, it was cannon of different sizes and the carronade that were pretty much all you would find. However, as the 1820s rolled on, new kinds of guns and ammunition would appear. Guns would become bigger and heavier, and of course the shell gun would make its first major combat debut. But that's for another time, when we look at the development of naval artillery in the 19th century, taking us from the wonderful solid shot cannon that had sufficed as the main form of naval firepower pretty much since the inception of gunpowder aboard warships, through to the advent of the breech-loading rifled guns that would go on to develop into the weapons that would arm the great dreadnought fleets of World War I and World War II. But that's for another time. For now, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.